Welcome to session 24 of the study of John's Gospel. We pick up in this session in chapter 11 of John, beginning at verse 28. But before we dive in there, we need to remember all the incredible bombshells that Jesus so far has dropped upon the Pharisees, the religious elite, the political class, even among his disciples. Let's remember some of the bombshells that he lays before them. He said he was the water of life, the bread of life, and the light of the world. Now, you know what that means already from all the sessions we've gone through, that Jesus was saying before them that he was the Torah, the scripture, in flesh and blood standing before them, because that's what they called the first 5 books of the Bible, what they called the Torah. They called it the water of life, the bread of life, and the light of the world. Then by the time we get into chapter 10, Jesus said he was the good shepherd. And that was a reference that came out of Ezekiel chapter 34, where Jesus says, I'm the long-awaited promised king that God said would come. Not only that, in Ezekiel 34, God himself said he was the good shepherd. And now Jesus says, I'm the good shepherd. Meaning, he says, I'm the good king that is promised to come. And he was even making himself equal with God. And now in chapter 11, he's dropped another bombshell. He dropped it this time on Martha and upon the disciples who were there and others who were listening when Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. And that was the hope that when Messiah came, those who had died, who were faithful Jews, would bodily rise to life, as we looked in Daniel chapter 12, and it's elsewhere throughout the Old Testament as well. Now, Jesus has just finished his conversation with Martha. And this is where now we pick up in verse number 28. And so what I'm going to do now is ask you to stop the video at this point, and I would ask you to read, if you will, chapter 11, beginning at verse 28 and go all the way through 37. So stop the video at this time and read John chapter 28, John chapter 11, 28 through 37. Well, since you read chapter 11, verses 28 to 37 of John's Gospel, anything in there that strikes you very interesting? Well, if there is, I hope you jotted it down because maybe we will answer the question you have as we work through this. So let's pick up at verse 28. John writes, when she had said this, now this is Martha. Now, when Martha had said this, she went and called her sister Mary, saying in private, the teacher is here and is calling for you. So now Martha has already had her conversation with Jesus. We know what that conversation was if you go back verses 21 all the way to 27 of chapter 11. Now Martha goes back and talks to her sister Mary, verse 29. And when she heard it, meaning when Mary heard it, she rose quickly and went to him, meaning going to Jesus. So Martha goes to Mary, tells Mary, Mary gets up, and she goes out to find Jesus as well. Now verse 30. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. Verse 31. When the Jews who were with her in the house consoling her saw Mary rise quickly and go out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. So now everyone's in the house. All the mourners were there. Family was probably there. The professional mourners, remember we talked about them as well? They were there as well. They all get up and they go with Mary out to where they think she's going. They think she's going to the tomb to weep there, to grieve there. And so they're going to follow her and do the same. Verse 32. Now when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him, now listen to what she said. I think as you read this, you know she says almost identical words as her sister said to Jesus. She says, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Verse 33. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. Let's stop there for a moment. Death was never, ever part of God's plan. Humans to die was not part of God's plan. Now, I know some will disagree with that, but if you go back and look very carefully, especially at the first chapter, the first couple chapters, you get the very clear impression that man was not intended to die physically. That all occurs when sin comes into the picture in Genesis chapter 3. Death hurts. You all know it. We know when we face the death of a loved one, and when that loved one dies, that hurts us. It hurts us deep to our soul because it is not a natural part of what God intended life to be. And so now Jesus is moved. Excuse me. Mary is weeping. Everyone else is weeping. Martha's weeping. Everybody is upset because death has never been part of God's plan. And if we look at our world today, we will agree with that. Death is not natural. I know we're being some try to tell us today that death is just part of living, but it is not. It is not part of God's original plan. Death creeped in when sin blasted into this world. And you and I know what it feels like inside to lose a loved one. Now, let's pick up in verse 34. And he said, Jesus says now, where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. And now verse 35, very interesting. Jesus wept. He too was moved to tears. And I believe he was weeping. And I believe this because he knows inside of himself that death is never and was never part of God's original plan. But he also knows that death came because of sin. And he knows that he too will face death as well. And what we will find out from St. Paul in another study, if we ever get to one in Corinthians, that he who knew no sin, meaning Jesus, became sin for you and me. So he had to bear the sin of the world. Sin had to come upon Jesus, so he would face death as well. And I think he's weeping for all of that, all the consequences that death brought into this world. And then in verse 36, so the Jews said, see how he loved him. But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also kept this man from dying? There's still confusion about Jesus. Remember what happened in chapter 9. He gave the man born blind sight. And now they had all witnessed this. They all heard about it. And they're going, why couldn't he get here soon enough to heal his close friend Lazarus? And so some were marveling at how much Jesus loved Lazarus and Mary and Martha as his grief was overflowing. And others were going, why did he just get here sooner and heal him? He healed the blind man, and he's healed others as well. And so there's all of this going on. There's all sorts of confusion about Jesus. There's all sorts of reactions about Jesus. There's Mary and Martha reacting to Jesus. The disciples are wondering what's taking place with all of this. The professional mourners are there. All of this is taking place around this scene and around this episode. So, what I want you to do now, again, is stop the video. And I would ask you now to read verses 38 to 44. 38 to 44. And you want to talk about the next bombshell going kaboom? It is in these verses 38 to 44. Well, I know you just finished reading John 11, 38 to 44. And I know you saw the next big bombshell that exploded before your very eyes as you read it. It is in the midst of this that finally the glory of God is revealed in Jesus in a powerful, dramatic way. Let's go and look at the text. 38. Then Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. So now, he goes to the tomb, and what we're told next by John, it was a cave, and a stone laid against it. We can stop there for a moment. It is obvious from the cave that is there, it's a burial cave, And it is pretty clear that Lazarus, Mary, and Martha had some money and had the ability to buy a burial cave or had one dug out for themselves and for their family. Now, what is interesting about these burial caves, when you walked into them, they're very interesting. You go inside, and there's actually some chambers. And what they would do, the burial practices were this way in the day of Jesus, at least in these caves. The body was put in there and wrapped, all right, in one of the chambers. There was an open area when you walked in, and the family would gather after they laid the body there, and they would have some prayer and a meal, whatever, and then they would go out. The tomb was sealed by a big stone. They would let the body be in there a year or two, and then they would finally go in there, and by that time, because of the humidity and all that was going on, the flesh would finally be eaten away from the bones. The bones were wrapped up and they were buried then in a box and put into the ground. Very interesting burial practices. So now, that's just a little bit of the background of the burial practices in the first century. So now, verse 39 says this. Jesus said, "Take the stone away." Now, move it. They have to have a crew that's going to come and move that stone because it's heavy. One person's not going to do it, so they have a crew that would come and move the stone. Now, Martha said the following. Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to Jesus, "Lord," listen carefully to these words, "Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead 4 days." Now, remember this. Remember in the previous unit, we talked about the 4 days. Let's remind ourselves what that is about. The Jews had an interesting belief. They said at the moment of death, your soul, your spirit, would rise from the body and hover over the body for 3 days with the hope that it could rejoin the body and the body would come back to life. But they said by the 4th day, when decay started to set in, the soul then would go to a place called Sheol and be cut off from God and remembered no more. If you want to go and look at that, open up to Psalm 88. Read Psalm 88 all the way through, and you'll find a part in there where the psalmist knows he is close to death, and he doesn't want to die because he doesn't want to go to Sheol and be cut off from God and remembered no more. So, go read Psalm 88. Take your time. You can read it whenever, but go read Psalm 88. Now, Martha says he's been in the tomb 4 days, meaning he is truly dead. The body's going to be stinking by this point because decay has set in. His soul now is down in Sheol, cut off from God and remembered no more. And she says, don't open that thing because it's going to stink. There's going to be a stench in there from him. Now it says this in verse 40. Jesus says to Martha, he said the following, Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? The glory of God is now going to be manifested. And finally, Jesus is referring back to that conversation he had earlier in verses 21 to 27, where she said she believed that Jesus was the resurrection and the life. And now he says, didn't I tell you if you believe, you would see the glory of God manifested itself? Now, this is important to stop and know this. The glory of God. The Jews believed that the glory of God hovered in the temple, but that the glory had left before the Jews went to Babylon some 600 years earlier when he went to exile. But there was ever no mention at all from this point forward when they came back from Babylon that the glory of God ever returned to the Jerusalem temple. There's no mention of it. There was the hope of it. The Jews hoped that the glory of God would come back, but there's no mention that the glory of God did come back. And Jesus now says, listen to what Jesus says again. Did I not tell you that if you believe, you would see the glory of God? Remember already in chapter 2, Jesus made the claim that he is the living temple. And where does the glory come to? But to the living temple. Now, look at verse 41. So they took away the stone, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Now listen to what Jesus says. Now remember, there's Mary and Martha there. The professional mourners are there. Family is there. Friends are there. The disciples are there. Now Jesus prays to his Father. Now remember, there's always that close connection between Jesus and his Father. He's been talking about it throughout this gospel. And it says this, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me. Did you get that picture? That they may believe, Father, that you, Father, sent me, Jesus. The glory of God is going to be manifested. The glory of God is going to be seen. The glory of God is going to be witnessed in this event. Verse 43. When Jesus had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The man who had died came out, his hands and feet bound with linen strips, and his face wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, unbind him and let him go. The glory of God is seen. The glory has come because the hope was that when Messiah came, righteous Jews would bodily rise to life again. And Jesus was saying, look, I'm here. A righteous Jew is bodily rise to life. And everybody's witnessing it. People are seeing. The glory of God is now being manifested for everyone there to see. Mary, Martha, the professional mourners, family, friends in the village, the 12 disciples are all there. And guess who else? Lazarus, who had been dead 4 days, is now bodily raised. And now he's standing there, and Jesus said, I love this. Unbind him. Let him go. Unbind him. Be free. He's free now. He was bound for death, and now he is free. So, I want you to read this again. I want you to go back 38 through, if you will, 38 through 44. Read it again. Then pick up and read 45 to the end of the chapter. Well, you've read chapter 11, 45 to the end of chapter 11. And let's look for a few moments at verses 46 or 45 and 46. This is what John writes. Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what Jesus did, believed in him. So many are going, oh my, the Messianic age has arrived. The Messiah is here. Wow, we've got to follow this man, because they believed him to be the promised one now, the promised king that God said would come, their Messiah, their deliverer, who would finally drive the Romans out and get rid of the Romans for good. But look what verse 46 says. But, I love when that word comes in there, but some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. So, a number believe in him, and others were going, the religious leaders need to know about this. The Pharisees need to know about this. And they go and say, hey, you know what just happened? This is crazy. And they told the Pharisees. Now, look what occurs in verse 47. So the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the council and said, let's stop there right there. The chief priests. We've talked about the Pharisees, but let's talk a little bit about the priesthood. We need to take just a few moments and go through who the priests really were. The history of the priesthood, including the chief priest, is rather interesting. They were all male descendants of the priest Aaron, the brother of Moses. They were responsible for the entire sacrificial system in Israel. They were also to be the teachers of the people. They taught the people supposedly the scriptures. The priests wore 4 special garments consisting of a tunic, a sash, a headdress, and some breeches. All right. The high priest and the chief priests wore 4 other garments as well. They included an ephod that was worn over the tunic, a breastplate, the robe of the ephod, and a plate hanging in front of their turban. And so the priests wore very elaborate garments. And it was a sign to the people of who they were. The regular priests wore certain. The chief priest wore other garments, including the high priest. Also about the priests, so you know, they did not own any land. They couldn't own any land. And therefore they were dependent upon the people to financially support them. Each Israelite in Israel was required to give the priest a fraction of his crop as a sacred donation. The priest also ate portions of the sacrifice offered in the temple. Now, what was to happen is this. If I brought a lamb or whatever to be sacrificed, the lamb would be sacrificed, the meat would be taken, and the meat would be boiled. And finally, when the fat was all burned away, that fat was an offering up to God, the priest was able to stick the fork in, and whatever the priest brought out, that was his food for himself and his family and so on. All right? So this is how the priests supported themselves through the donations of the people, but also this is how they had food as well. According to the law of Moses, very important, the law of Moses, the Torah, all right? The first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the water of life, the bread of life, and the light of the world. That's what they called him. And now Jesus is calling himself that. According to the law of Moses, the priest is forbidden to marry a divorcee, a harlot, a woman who has undergone the ceremony of exempting her from a levirate marriage, or a proselyte. So the requirements for marriage were very strict for a priest. Also, if the priest would marry such a woman as I just listed, he would be excluded now from the priesthood. So, just a little background on the priests at the time of Jesus. Now, let's go to verse 47. So the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the council and said, now the council is the Sanhedrin. This was this Jewish ruling body. There were 70 of them in the Sanhedrin. So now, if you have the chief priests, you had the Pharisees, and now you have the Sanhedrin, you're talking about a large group of men meeting. In that group would have been the high priest. And at that time, he was Caiaphas. Now, let's go back to 47 again. So the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the council and said, what are we to do? For this man performs many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. Stop that. We got to talk about that. What was the fear? The fear was the Romans. The Romans would tolerate no other king, no Messiah, no Jewish Messiah would they ever tolerate. And the fear amongst the Sanhedrin, the Pharisees, the chief priests, was that many of the Jews were believing in Jesus. And if more continued to believe in Jesus by all the signs he had done, and now especially this one, raising Lazarus from the dead, who had been dead 4 days, they were fearful the Romans would come and they would squash any type of Jewish uprising. Because the hope was this: when Messiah came, he would gather a large army together and they would go forth and defeat the enemies that were conquering them. And they were going, my gosh, the Romans will come down. Remember that this time the Romans had the most powerful military on the face of the planet. And they were fearful that Rome would come in and destroy their place. And what they meant by that was the temple. That's what they meant by their place. And also this right here, the nation. Those were the issues that the leadership was worried about, was the temple and the nation. It was far more than just their own personal standing in life. It was the temple and their nation. And that's what they were greatly fearful of. If everyone thought that Jesus was Messiah, if everyone believed that he was the one, they were fearful the Romans were going to come in and just destroy their temple and their nation, as the Babylonians had done in 587 BC. Let's continue. Verse 49. But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, Caiaphas was high priest. Now, I put the picture of the temple in there and said Caiaphas high priest because I want you to keep that name in your mind and listen to what he says in verse 49 leading into 50. You know nothing at all. This is what he says to the Pharisees, to the chief priests, to the Sanhedrin members. As high priest, he says, you know nothing at all, nor do you understand that it is better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish. So what Caiaphas was saying, it's far better that one man, this Jesus, die for the people, than our nation be destroyed, our temple be destroyed. You know what's interesting about that is what St. John writes in this next verse. I want you to see what John writes in verse 51. He did not say this of his own accord, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but to also gather into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. Now, verse 53, from that day on, they made plans to put him to death. Right here, Jesus was tried in absentia. And what's interesting is Caiaphas was right. It was better that one man should die for the people. And isn't that what gives us our redemption and our salvation as well? That one man died for all. Caiaphas was speaking under the inspiration of the Spirit of God, and he had no clue he was doing it. And that's how God works. God is so powerful, he is so dynamic, that he can work through even those who are trying to thwart his will. And I think we need to remember that even today. Now I just want to read 54 to the end to finish out this unit today, or this chapter, excuse me. Jesus therefore no longer walked openly among the Jews, but went from there to the region near the wilderness, to a town called Ephraim, and there he stayed with his disciples. So Jesus knows from the moment he raised Lazarus, his time is short. And so he goes off to Ephraim, gets away from the city of Jerusalem, gets away from all the political and religious leaders, and sort of, if you will, is lying low for a little bit. 55. Now the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and many went up from the country to Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves. They were looking for Jesus and saying to one another as they stood in the temple, "What do you think, that he will not come to the feast at all?" Now the chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that if anyone knew where he was, they should let them know, so they might arrest him. Plans are now in motion. Jesus is tried in chapter 11. This is where, in John's gospel, the trial narrative takes place between the Jewish Sanhedrin, the Pharisees, the chief priest, and Jesus. And Jesus is tried, not even being there, but he was tried and convicted based on the fact that he raised Lazarus from the dead. And the Jews couldn't take it because their fear was, remember their fear, was that the Romans would come, see Jesus as Messiah, as the king, and destroy the nation and the temple and the city of Jerusalem. They've already been through that in the past history, and they don't want to go through it again. This was the fear. This is why at this point in John's gospel, they will order his death, and they will do everything they can to get rid of Jesus. So, as we conclude this session 24, go back and read all of John 11. Just read it all again and let it just burn into your minds. And then when you're done, start in chapter 1 and read all the way through 11 and keep this flow of the gospel going. Because now, the next session, we'll get into chapter 12. Some interesting things will occur in chapter 12. And so please read chapter 12, if you will, as we prepare for our next session as well. So, until next time, may God continue to bless you and strengthen you and lead you. See you later.